This is the crescendo of the program now. And for this, I'd ask the panel members to come up and take their seats if they would. And as they do that, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this evening's dialogue. We're very, very, very pleased and fortunate this year to have Jeremy Smith returning as moderator. He performed this function last year to great acclaim, and I think you'll see he knows exactly how to get folks to answer interesting questions and toss out interesting observations. Jeremy is a graduate of the college. Okay. He's a graduate of the college. He has an MFA in creative writing. He lives here in Missoula. He's a very accomplished writer. His most recent book is called Epic Measures. It's an incredible read. I encourage you to think about it. And I would point out, and Jeremy would probably want me to, that I think within the last month it was issued in a paperback edition. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you. It was just really inspiring to hear from the teachers and see them. It made me want to go back to school, or at least go to Milkshake. We're only 3 days away from Milkshake Monday, so I'll remember that. What is truth? I looked it up. It is the state or quality of being true. So
there you have it.
At this point, it's just commentary, but we'll do that. I wanted to sort of share these wonderful faculty members that are going to kind of answer it from their different domains of knowledge and experience. Jim Murray, who's right here to my right, is a trial lawyer specializing in suing insurance companies in jurisdictions across the country. So if you are an insurance company,
look out.
He was raised on a farm on the Fort Peck Reservation and graduated from the University of Montana with a degree in philosophy. He received a Rhodes Scholarship and earned legal degrees from Oxford and Harvard Law School. Jim clerked on the Third Circuit in Philadelphia and was special assistant to the director of the FBI, where he reviewed all FBI wiretaps prior to court approval. He serves on evidence committees for the American College of Trial Lawyers and was a 2014 recipient of UM's Distinguished Alumni Award. And we're going to get to grill him. Betsy Bach, far right, has a checkered past. Her first real job was as a police officer tasked with mediating domestic altercations, and she later co-owned a vineyard and winery. Mm-hmm. Now she is a professor of communication studies at the University of Montana, where she has worked for 33 years. She specializes in organizational communication and co-teaches a class in propaganda of Nazi Germany and the German Democratic Republic. She has been recognized with UM's Distinguished Teaching Award and UM's Academic Administrator Award, and in 2009 she served as president of the National Communications Association in Washington, D.C. Doug Emlen in the middle. His research has been featured in the New York Times and on National Public Radio. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a recipient of the U.S. Presidential Early Career Award in Science and Engineering, a 5-year career award from the National Science Foundation, and a Young Investigator Prize and the E.O. Wilson Naturalist Award from the American Society of Naturalists. And E.O. Wilson blurbed my book, so that's, very meaningful to me. His book, Animal Weapons, The Evolution of Battle, won the Phi Beta Kappa Science Book Award in 2014. And his textbook, Evolution, Making Sense of Life, is used by more than 200 universities and colleges. So, that's their smarts, but we'll try to not take them too seriously. We'll grill them. We'll have fun, and I'll ask them some questions one at a time. Then I'll ask them some questions as a panel, and then you can hop up and ask them questions yourself. So this will just be the practice, my part. So I wanted to start with Jim. I was going to just do a few short questions in a row for a legal perspective. So you studied philosophy at the University of Montana. From that perspective, what did they teach you? What is truth as you learned it as a young philosopher?
You get that question in the abstract, and it has to remind you of St. Augustine. He said, what is time? Obviously I know what time is when I think about it, and you asked me to explain it, and I know not what it is. But that's the reason for the last 2,400 years, philosophers, humanists, mathematicians, I like the comment connecting math to beauty, have been reflecting on this issue. But the most infamous, most famous example was a trial. I think in John 19, the trial of Jesus, Pontius Pilate says, so you are king of the Jews? And Jesus says, you say I'm king of the Jews. I came into this world to bear witness to truth. And Pontius Pilate says, what is truth? And it's hard to tell from the scripture whether he's mimicking Jesus or whether he has a momentary flash of inquisitiveness. But it doesn't really matter because he doesn't stay around for the answer, or else we wouldn't have to be talking about it now. He walks out to get the verdict and comes back with the verdict. So very quickly, and again, I feel very self-conscious with Tom Huff and many other people there being able to explain this. The dime store version of the last 2,400 years are three things, and I think it helps and it connects the sciences. One theory is the correspondence theory of truth. This piece of paper is in my hand. The proposition is true if something in the world corresponds with that proposition, with that statement. So this is true. Now, this is kind of the non-thinking man theories of truth. It's great for anything in the world, anything you see, anything you can touch. It doesn't do so well for abstracts. So P, if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Where is that? Where is that in the world? It's up there. Well, that's actually Plato. If you want to buy into Plato's metaphysics, he would say it is up there. It's a universal. It's somewhere in the world of forms. If you can't buy into that, the theory doesn't explain much on its own. It's the Beatles sitting there, but what else? So the coherence theory of truth says that if what's really true about a proposition is if it hangs together in a body of knowledge and explains things in this world in the body of knowledge. And so for symbolic logic, a great example of that. Nothing hangs together better than the rules of symbolic logic. I remember Burke Townsend before the final exam saying, quit thinking, just have faith in the rules. And just do it. And by God, that it worked. It's just, I don't know why we did well, but it worked. The problem is with coherence theories that there can be multiple inconsistent coherence theories depending on what you believe or what boundaries you put on it. So that's not good enough either. But it does help. And then the final theory is the pragmatist theory, which says a proposition is true if it advances the theory for which you're advancing it, if it is functionally helpful. So if I want to say this paper's in my hand, and my goal is to get everybody in this room to look at this paper, that's been a true statement. It's fulfilled its goal. The problem is the pragmatist theory could never distinguish between truth and a really successful lie. I tell my 8-year-old daughter the night before Christmas, you got to get to sleep. And if you get to sleep, because Santa won't come otherwise. And it fulfilled its purpose wonderfully. It was true in that sense, but it was a lie. And so, not to mention that none of these theories explain the most important things about truth: beauty, true love. What is true love? Is there such a thing? And so that's the things that we've been grappling with. That's the outline in the philosophy, which I haven't thought about in 30 years, but it's kind of fun to think about it again.
Correspondence, coherence, pragmatisms. Okay, by comparison, what is legal truth?
Yeah, so this is something I'm pretty passionate about in the trial world, and it kind of has elements of all of these. Legal truth for the trial world is, of course, in my view, what happens with the verdict. What does the jury do? Now, I'm not saying it's omniscient. If we were all omniscient, if we were all God, we wouldn't need juries. We would have seen the murder. We would have seen the car accident. We would have known what was going to happen. We're not God. And so, as I frequently tell juries in closing arguments, in the right case, there's a lot of criticism of this jury system. There's a lot wrong with this jury system, but it also happens to be the best system of justice devised in the history of civilization. So let's go from there. And so the way I look at it is there's a coherence theory of what's in this courtroom. You walk into that case, there's nothing in here, nothing. And the only thing that can come in here is evidence. either in the form of testimony or objects. And the only way it can get in here is if it has passed certain boundaries of truth in the rules of civil procedure and the rules of evidence, which I carry around with me, and I wish I could apply to Kellyanne Conway. I moved to strike that from the record. And at the end of the day, time-tested rules of evidence help us determine on a more likely than not basis in a civil case, on a beyond a reasonable doubt basis in a criminal case, what is true. That verdict is true within the limited bounds of that coherence theory.
So I'm sure you guys have some questions about whether the verdict is true, but we'll save that for a second. I had sort of a television watcher question. Do people who give testimony at trial really swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth? So help them God. Does that actually happen?
They have to. Yeah, they do. It's embedded in the rules of evidence. And of course, lawyers, and again, it's a whole other subject, but we swear to the court when we take the bar license to tell the truth. We can be disbarred if we don't. We're officers of the court. We can't procure false evidence. I would venture that lawyers worry more and are up more at 3 in the morning, not just to go to the bathroom, than most other professions. That said, when you come into the courtroom, you still take the oath or affirmation. You don't have to do it on a Bible anymore for obvious reasons, but you can do the affirmation. And, to help people along with the truth, the U.S. Code provides up to a 5-year prison sentence for telling anything. Anything false is perjurious if you are under oath. You, as a matter of social contract, have raised your right hand. If you didn't want to do it, you could have pled the fifth or suffered the other consequences. But you suffer those consequences at the risk of telling the truth. So it's a very, very important part of this legal system, and it's what helps protect this room as the evidence begins to filter into it.
So you've called the rules of evidence guardians of truth in court. And I guess I'm wondering, what do you mean, or what are some examples from your career? What are these rules of evidence? What are some examples?
And so look, I was in the McGovern campaign in '72. I was the youngest delegate. I was walking back from the food service to Jesse Hall, and I knew we were going to win. And I hadn't gotten back to the hall when some student came out and said it was over. It was only 5 in the afternoon in Montana. At that point, I knew in my life I wanted more certainty, and and I wanted certainty about truth. And I know that's less, it's less impressive in some ways than politics. But what the rules of evidence do, in my view, is to take hundreds of years of tested methods of truth and only allow people to say that. You can't say that, Kellyanne, unless it meets these rules. And so, for example, you can't say what somebody has said outside of court. That's hearsay. And I don't get to cross-examine you and test the truth of that. There are exceptions that have been tested for 400 years. If you're being stabbed with a knife, and while the knife is in you, you're yelling out, "Stop stabbing me!" That statement is part of the re gestae. It's part of the act. It comes as an exception to the hearsay rule. In the commercial context, if you say something that is against your financial interest on a contract, you normally don't go around saying things against your interest just for the fun of it. So that statement is actually defined as not hearsay. It will come in as not hearsay. And the whole purpose of the rules is to advance truth within that room as the evidence comes in. Limited, yes, but a wonderful sense of justice, the best we know it, yes.
Can something be true and not admissible?
Absolutely. Yes, it can be true. And that.
What's an example?
Well, the workhorse of the rule of evidence for the lawyers in here know, and it's cited in every trial, is Rule 403, which says something might be probative. It might go to the fact of whether a fact at the trial is more likely than not, but it might be outweighed by prejudice, or a waste of time, mainly prejudice. And so, for example, I had a case last year where my client suing an insurance company 80 years ago. One parent of the company had been owned in part by the Third Reich. Had nothing to do with this trial. It was 80 years ago. I knew damn well the insurance company was going to try to bring that up. Mm-hmm. And probably part of background it should have been. You file a rule, it's not allowed to be said. But think about the things that are said now in politics. The purpose, they don't even have probative value, but if they did, they're clearly outweighed by prejudice. And every trial, 4 or 5 things, get excluded, that the judge, pursuant to these rules, has said that you risk prejudicing the jury and not giving weight to the evidence.
So by prejudice, you mean it will make people not like you for reasons that don't have to do with the matter at hand?
Exactly. I mean, pattern evidence, these rules say you can't judge a person's act based on what they've done in the past, with limited exceptions. That doesn't prove that what they did in this case, what they did in the past. So that type of prejudice is excluded explicitly. But the judge has the ability under 403 to react on the spot and say that is prejudicial. That shouldn't be said.
So truth in the court has to be on topic. Is that another
It
word?
has to be on topic to the issue at hand, absolutely.
So last question for Jim in this moment. You pick what facts you present in making a case. So does the other side. And I guess, how is that kind of storytelling different from spinning? And does it get us to the truth? Or is it just sort of two competing stories?
It's a great question. I'm passionate about it. My wife, I can't even watch legal shows because the evidentiary rules, are not right, and the storytelling that goes on is what you're talking about. And I'm passionate that a good trialer must be a storyteller. But what don't I mean? I don't mean a story that you're making it up. I don't mean a story that you're not telling the truth. What I mean is the story by the campfire that has happened for tens of thousands of years, the story of the hunt, the true story of the hunt, of what happened. Tell me again, Dad, about that time that you got in a fight in college. Tell me the story of that. It's embedded in my mind. Tell me again. It's true. Most importantly, it's from the point of view of the person you're representing. So these facts have come in. We're not picking facts. At the end of the trial, in the closing, there's a certain set of facts in this room. And you can only argue from those facts. And indeed, in closing, when you're allowed to argue, you can make inferences from those facts, but you can't make an irrational or unreasonable inference from a fact. That you could be stopped in closing on. So it's very narrowly circumscribed. So what you want to do, and what you are obliged to do, is to respond to your story, tell your story from the point of view of the evidence that people will respond to. So for me, if I can, my clients, these are difficult cases. It's frequently Boeing in a pollution case or the Catholic Church in a sexual abuse case against an insurance company. No matter what the case, for me, is if I can get the jury to identify with how they were treated on their auto insurance or their home insurance. Is that walking a fine line on 403? It may be, but if I can have claims handling practices in evidence, I'm allowed to argue that. And I can see the eyes change in a jury when I'm talking on insurance. If I can get them to identify with the issue, I have every right and obligation to tell that from that perspective. It's not a story in the sense that it's false. It's not a false or what's an alternative fact story.
Do you get frustrated hearing the other side's stories? Or do you respect the gamesmanship of it? Or
There's nothing. I respect a good lawyer on the other side telling their side of the story, because there's always going to be two sides of the story, of the same facts. We see things differently. An auto accident, the plaintiff's going to see it differently from what happened from the defendant. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
I want to switch to Doug for a scientist,
different view.
for a scientist perspective. So yeah, I kind of wanted to. Evolution is such a grand topic. I wanted to kind of go to a little more personal. So you went to Panama to study beetles earlier in your career.
Did.
So we've got a place and we've got a topic. What question were you asking, or were you just trying to get a trip to Panama?
So this is all based on the idea that there's a narrative, right? So this is telling my story. I am a scientist, so I'll just say at the outset that I have a very different take on a lot of these things. The way that I tend to think about it, there is an answer out there. Something happened, or the way the world works in a particular way. So there is an absolute. The question is, how close can we come to that? And I adhere to the scientific method, a process that we use to gather information, and if we do it properly, ratchet our way closer to the truth, the correct answer, which is presumably objective and not part of the narrative. So going back in time to Panama, I was interested in beetles. I studied animal weapons. I wanted to answer a question, why some of these beetles have these huge weapons on their bodies like tusks or horns, but in this case they're on a beetle, and why other species in the same area doing the same basic thing did not. And so as a scientist, it's like, why do some animals have these things and others not? And I used a process of designing experiments, watching what they did, comparing the behavior and the activities of species with the weapons to species without the weapons to try to figure out what was so special. What was the trigger that caused these arms races or the evolution of these weapons in these animals? And
So how do you, I kind of want, I've seen courtroom dramas. I haven't seen beetle dramas. So how do
they
you
have
watch?
dramas, they fight.
How do you watch the beetles? Do you get on your belly? Do you have a camera? Do you, hire school children to take shifts?
So I'm trying to figure out how to spin this, how to put this in the context of what we're talking about. But part of the answer, I mean, you could say, why hadn't somebody figured that out before? And assuming it's not just because nobody else cared. It's because there were pieces of information that I was able to bring to the table that nobody had been able to provide before. And in that case, it was how I watched them. There are lots of beetles that fight these big, crazy, scramble-like battles on the ground, and you can sit there and watch them with a camera or just take your notes and watch what they're doing. The guys that I was interested in that had these horns, they disappeared. You couldn't do that. They would go over to a tunnel, dig into a tunnel, and they're gone. And so for years, people had assumed that these weapons weren't used in males fighting males the way that they would be in elk or deer or elephants, that something else had to be going on because they'd watched all these fights and they'd watched all these beetles, and the beetles without the horns fight all over the place all the time, but the ones with the horns, they never fight. They just walk right by each other. The answer was what was going on underground. So I had to build these little ant farms, these sort of sandwiches of glass with dirt packed in between.
So it was like a beetle fight club.
I had a whole room full of beetle fight clubs, all these little chambers set up, and I could watch what was happening underground, and it was providing that additional piece of information that sort of answered the story. In this case, it was the fact that they were fighting inside tunnels was the game changer. It caused the beetles to face each other one at a time in these sort of one-on-one contests, and it turns out that animals that fight in those kinds of contests, they fight a type of battle where bigger weapons help. And I could do the experiments. I could measure the sizes of the beetles and the lengths of the horns and look at the fights and see who won and show pretty cleanly with evidence, again, that the males with the longer horns were winning this kind of a fight. So I watched them by building ant farms and looking at what was happening underground.
So, forgive me,
But
I've got a bias or a personal concern, but what about the beetles that didn't have the really big
well, that was
weapons? How are they able to survive or thrive, or were they not?
Well, so survive and thrive, they do these are all dung beetles, the least glamorous animals out there, right? So they're all coming into the same habitats, they're all feeding on the same kinds of foods. The males are all fighting with each other over access to females. So in a sense, their biology is the same. Dung beetle's a dung beetle. You're in Panama in the rainforest, they're all at the same place. But what differed between these animals was how they fought. It was the details of the battle. And it turns out if you're fighting in a big scramble, there's really no advantage to a big weapon. There's no way to brace yourself or use it for leverage in a predictable or a consistent way. And the fights are pandemonium, so the outcome is largely due to chance anyway. But in a duel where you're fighting one-on-one, that's a situation where a male can bring a weapon to bear, it can use it, and the bigger, the stronger males, the ones with the bigger weapons tended to win. So they're all sort of going about their lives in the same way. There was one key difference in their behavior that seemed to explain the patterns I was looking at. And again, I want to bring it back. I know you're doing this to sort of show who we are and develop our character, but I want to bring it back to the truth issue, because this is what we do as a scientist. I wanted to answer that question. I had to design experiments to look at what these animals were doing and let the answers from those experiments sort of guide me to the next step. And I had to compare across species. If this explanation was going to work, then the evidence I gathered for one species ought to apply to other species.
So in science, what are those next steps? I mean, we have precedent or whatever in trial, but also they just do the same. They can have a similar case that kind of repeats and see what the next jury says. So in your case,
well,
once you had your sort of, I've seen this is what happens in this fight club, and this is what happens above ground. What were the next steps for you or for other scientists?
Well, so now I had a more carefully formulated idea. I had sort of a hypothesis for why some of these species were entering into these arms races and getting bigger and bigger weapons and why others were not. So one of the logical things to do then is to start looking at other animals and to see if that same critical precondition helps explain the evolution of weapons in other types of animals. Like, I mean, you could pick anything, fiddler crabs, it works for chameleons. It turns out that was one of the next steps I took, was to look across all these different animals, and that same distinction in behavior seems to be the key ingredient, the sort of missing piece to the puzzle that explains why some species enter into these arms races. and not others. So again, it's a process of accumulating evidence. And again, I want to come back to the issue of what is truth. The answer is out there. I'm either right or wrong. I am reasonably confident at this point that my answer is correct because there is evidence from my study. There are evidence from a dozen other people that have studied these things in other animals that all sort of point to the same answer. There's evidence from all these other types of animals that all point to the same answer. The more evidence you accumulate for an explanation, the more confidence we have that it's the truth, or that it's approaching the thing that I consider to be absolute, which is the answer, the truth. And I'll just add in my case a huge twist just to show the way that we would approach this. For me, while researching the book that you mentioned, I had a chance to look at a totally different kind of literature, the military literature. Turns out that there's a whole bunch of scholars that have spent their whole careers looking at arms races in military technologies. They're not biologists, they're not evolutionary biologists, they're not thinking about the problem the same way that I am. And all of these scholars had come to exactly the same conclusion. They'd identified the same trigger. It's a duel. It's a one-on-one confrontation between rival tanks, rival airplanes, rival soldiers on the battlefield, rival nations, like in the Cold War. A one-on-one showdown is the spark that triggers an arms race. So now here I am as a scientist. I started out in Panama looking at beetles, and the answer that I came to is the same that the answer that all the military scholars have come to. Now I feel like we're getting pretty close to the truth. But again, the idea is truth is objective. We're doing the best we can to get to it.
It's almost
but
like
the answer is an absolute.
It's almost like you try to
vantage.
find like one thing that's true and then see can you make it slightly broader with the next category?
Well,
and the next
ideally, it's more interesting if the truths that we identify are generalizable, if they apply across contexts.
Can I inject 10 seconds? I do get paid by the hour. But this is a paradigm of coherence reasoning. I mean, of coherent theory of truth. I mean, and that's what you're doing, right? And scientific theory, scientific method does do well in that area. And you can't just ignore evidence. You can't just ignore a piece. You have to tie the world together. And if it doesn't fit, you've got to continue to dig.
Well, so there's a twist on that. And I know we're going to get to Betsy in a minute. I'll shut up and we can move on and do our order. But there is a twist there because you talked the other day about the fact that this is about the narrative. And I get the sense from what you're talking about in a courtroom, truth has a lot to do with the story that's behind it. I guess I feel like, no, it is technically whether I am effective at communicating my interpretation of the truth or not should be irrelevant. I mean, I think if I can tell that story better, if there's a good narrative behind it, it will resonate with other scientists and with the public at large. And so the idea might spread faster, but ultimately the answer is the answer. And even if I'm a really good storyteller, if the evidence doesn't back up what I'm saying, somebody's going to come along and do the test again and figure out that I'm wrong.
You're trying to find the story. The beetle can't talk. I mean, the beetle can't tell you the story. You're trying to find that story. That's what you're doing.
Here's a question I have. You said something that kind of puzzled me, and we will move on in a minute. But I had a couple questions. One was, you said scientists don't prove things; they gather evidence and let the data speak for itself. So what is the difference between truth and evidence for you?
For me.
For you.
Yeah, and I think where that comes from, and the thing that makes me cringe, for example, is when I watch commercials on television, and it's like, oh, scientists have proven this or proven that. It's a great way to sell products. I mean, the essence of a proof is it's absolute. You are 100% certain that you're right. And I don't think there's very much out there for which we can attribute that level of confidence. And so my son is frighteningly good budding mathematician. And for him, there are real proofs. I mean, you can show something that is absolute 100% all the time. You can't do that in the rest of life. But I think that, so as a scientist, we don't try to prove things, but what we do try to do is explain the world around us. We try to account for the phenomena that we see, and we try to do it in a way that is robust to evidence. So evidence is the material, the observations, the results of experiments, the things that we do to try to test whether our explanations line up with that absolute that I would call the truth. And if we do the process right, then we really do advance our knowledge considerably. We get very close to that very fast. And what I love about science is it's transparent. Again, it comes back, it gets away from the narrative. I mean, I think a narrative is good. I spend a lot of my life trying to communicate the excitement of science because I believe in trying to reach people. I believe in the connection that a narrative brings. But at the end of the day, whether the ideas I'm talking about are right or not has nothing whatsoever to do with whether I tell the story well. It has to do with whether the evidence backs it up. So science is transparent. I mean, we have to present to our peers and to the world the data that we accumulated, the design behind the experiments for which the data were collected, the analyses that we do. Nowadays, people even share the code they used for the analyses so that anybody can go and access the data and analyze it for themselves.
So, last question for a minute. We were talking a little earlier, and you talked about meeting our Secretary of the Interior, who our former congressman from Montana, Ryan Zinke. What was his take on the problems? You said it was a great conversation.
It was.
And
it was really.
But he also had he kind of put you in a
scared the
corner
daylights out
on
of me, yeah.
What was his take on the problems with scientific
We had a great discussion. At the very end of the discussion, he said, the problem with science these days is the analyses are so complicated that you can adjust a parameter here and there and get essentially any answer you want.
So, how did you respond in the moment? And how would you
I was rather dumbfounded at the moment. I wish I could. I mean, that's one of those things. I wish I could replay the tape.
Well, now you can replay the tape. How would you respond? Yeah.
I mean, it is true that analyses get complicated, and I work on. I mean, I'm not one of the experts in our programs here on genomics and genetics, but we have aspects of my research that get into this. This is a really cutting-edge area where you're dealing with spectacularly large data sets. I mean, huge amounts of information. And the analyses get complicated. And so it is true that the types of analyses we do to handle data sets like that aren't always intuitive. And it is also true that we adjust them. We try them different ways. We adjust parameters. We try to play around with the analyses to make sure that we really are getting an accurate characterization of the patterns that are there and the answers that are there. But that is something, again, in science, it's transparent. So what I wish I could have told him is no matter how complicated those analyses are and no matter how intuitive they are always transparent. The data are there. The analyses are there. Anybody can go and look at it. Anybody could reanalyze the data. And the kinds of things that we're talking about, the kinds of things he was concerned with, like climate change, that is backed up by thousands of studies, tons of different research programs, lots of kinds of analyses. So yeah, the analyses are complicated, but at the end of the day, the data speak for themselves. So what scared me, just to be clear about that statement, is everything I believe about science is that it is, I mean, I would argue the best way of knowing, but it is a robust way of knowing about the world around you because it is based on evidence and because it is self-correcting. If we get it wrong, it might take us decades to figure it out, but eventually new data, new experiments, new evidence will cause us to look at that problem in a new way, and we will change how we think about the world. The fact that it is self-correcting, to me, makes it a better way of knowing than lots of other things, but it works because it's objective. And so the idea that you tweak a parameter to get the result you want, what he'd essentially done is pull the carpet out from under everything that I do, everything that all my colleagues do. As soon as you peg science as subjective, you've put it in the arena of politics and everything else that out there that now it becomes a narrative because it's the people that shout the loudest or argue things the most effectively that are going to win. And you suddenly have divorced yourself from the data. And I see that as a very dangerous situation. So.
Well, even more dangerous would be to divorce the data from the narrative. I mean,
well, Betsy, I saved the communication specialist perspective for last because these guys just talk. They report, you decide. Yeah, let's get to truth. We're ready.
All right.
So before, as we said in your bio, before you entered academia, you worked as a police officer, mediating domestic altercations. And I was just curious, how did seeking the truth fit into keeping the peace for you? Are those because you're an investigator, but you're also a peacekeeper?
Yes. I mean,
it's like parenting a little bit.
It is like parenting, yeah. I mean, the first and foremost thing, of course, you have to do when you walk into a domestic dispute is get the lay of the land because you don't know what's going to happen. And you always go with somebody else. So you have to coordinate more or less with them ahead of time as to how you're going to get the truth because you don't want everybody turning on you. That can happen. When you walk in the door, two people are fighting. Very often when someone comes in, they can take their aggressions out on you. If you have at least two people, you can at least split them up. But you have to act first. Always. Separate get people apart. And then you have to go through sometimes the very quick process of finding out what the truth is. And in my experience, you can't really get at the truth. Rather, what you do is just look for who is the least deceptive in the way they're communicating information. Because
That's what science editors do, too.
Yeah. Well, as we, as has already been said, I mean, in this case, sometimes the truth comes out as two sides of the same facts. And so what you do is basically sit and listen to people, but also you have to look for evidence, just like in the scientific method, looking for bruises, looking to see who seems to be the least shaken up or the most truthful, as it were. I mean, it's hard to explain, but because the truth sometimes is always so clouded by, say, alcohol consumption or something else. So the goal of keeping the peace is first to separate people, try to find out what happened, and here the person who is the least deceptive is usually the one who wins the prize, in that they get to stay in the home rather than, walking out the door with silver handcuffs on. So
I want to shift topics a little because you've got a sort of a pretty broad discipline in that social science. I kind of want to ask some questions about truth in the social science. So you've researched organizational identity, sort of starting with how people join the particular workplaces they do and how they develop a sense of purpose and belonging on the job. And given that we're at work a lot, that just seems like probably maybe one of the most important things anyone could know, how you find purpose and belonging at the thing you do, like 8 hours, half your waking hours minimum probably. So it's interesting, but how on earth do you actually find out answers to something as sort of slippery as that, as purpose and belonging?
good question. The kind of research I do is qualitative in nature, which involves taking a look at the world and trying to understand the world from the perspective of the person who is having that experience at the time. So it involves a number of things, but seeking the truth, or at least evidence in that regard, usually involves extensive interviews with people, asking very carefully selected questions, and asking similar questions of everybody, so there is some uniformity in the responses that you receive. And the questions are, at least we typically write questions that allow people to explore and reflect and engage in a process that we call retrospective sense-making, asking people to sort of walk through experiences they have had. And a lot of the work I do is focused on something called either memorable messages or turning points, at least in this regard with organizational entry. We ask people to identify a significant message that they received that led to a change in the way they perceived the organization, whether it made them feel closer, a sense of belonging or membership or commonality with the organization and with other people in it. And then we will ask them to draw it on a graph and to just identify different times in their organizational life when they felt close to the organization, and then sort of connect the dots so they actually do get a graph where we figure out what caused people to affiliate more or to affiliate less.
Is it, I guess I'll put the same question two ways and you can decide.
Okay.
Is it, I'm just trying to think about how you assess, how someone can assess the validity or reliability of this, how people can trust the results that you're saying and not just know, oh, that's true for these 11 people you talked to, but not anybody else. So I guess I'll ask either why should people trust the results that you put out, or maybe more objectively you can say, how do you decide when reading other papers how to trust them?
Okay. This is a really hotly contested topic in qualitative methods, particularly when qualitative methods first became a method of inquiry in social sciences, and in my discipline in particular, about now 40 years ago. We were always arguing about validity, the credibility of the data, and also reliability or the replicability. Again, for those of you who don't know qualitative methods, they're a way of gathering data that recognize that social science is subjective and recognize that social science, or at least the researcher, is somewhat biased. Okay? And what we try to do is find out the actor's perspective, get the actor's view of the world in terms of his or her perceptions of cultural norms and values. It's descriptive, it's speculative, and by nature it can be very political because questions of what is true often arise. All right? One gathers qualitative data by going into the field and observing how people behave in their habitat, and again also asking them questions to reflect on their experience of the world. And as a result, what we try to do is look for credible and multiple informants so we can have more than one perspective, because people in organizations or in any culture have different perspectives, but there are also people who are of higher status, lower status. So we want to try to get as broad a perspective as we want. That's called, as one test of evidence, multivocality. Also, the researcher has to be in the setting long enough to be able to feel or believe that they are familiar with what, and not necessarily can predict what goes on in the setting, but have a good understanding of how people might react. Okay. Researchers, qualitative researchers, are trained to take copious amounts of field notes. And it's those notes and reflections on the interviews, as well as transcriptions of the interviews, that become the data. A study I completed about 4 years ago, we analyzed 1,500 single-spaced pages of data to try to get a sense of
And are these like sentences, or these aren't numbers in the same way, right?
No,
these are like, this is like someone saying, well, I started, when I was 17, and my mom was working at the checkout counter, so I followed her in, but the department store next door had a sign out, so I went in. Is that
again, many of these are responses to specific questions that we've asked, but also observing people in their habitat. One of the studies of organizational entry I did, I was in an organization that had a 6-week, very active socialization training program for their newcomers. So I sat in all these sessions. I listened to how people talked to the newcomers. I listened to how newcomers talked among themselves, and then came back and just wrote and wrote and wrote. It was the days before, computers. But that's what you do. I mean, you write, and you constantly reflect, and you. Just a couple other things. You just, as a researcher, you're very aware of the impact you have on the people there, and you have to be in the setting long enough so people are no longer playing up to you as the researcher. And you also then, once you start drawing conclusions, share your ideas with the members to see if it washes or jives with their perception.
I like that. I guess one question I have, you've sort of made the case, or sort of explained at least the process to us. And you spent these 3 years recently in DC trying to make the case for peer-reviewed social science to Congress. So is that what you know, did you talk about, we use 1,100 pages, of documentation, or did you kind of tell a couple flashy stories and say, this is how you'll get bang for the buck? Or how do you make the case to them, as we call them?
Well, carefully, all right? That's my initial response, very carefully. I mean, but like any good set of social scientists, we would, and communication people, okay, we always preach adapt to your audience, know your audience. So we would clearly research the congressperson or senator ahead of time that we were going to talk with. And for example, we found out one senator at the time had a mother who was about to go into Alzheimer's care. So what we did, of course, was bring recently published research from psychology and sociology on Alzheimer's and the impact of what this could be. He was going to put his mother in a Alzheimer's care home. Well, there's lots of research in psychology about impacts of that. So we were able to adapt to him, and he was like, wow, well, I didn't realize that, that was a really important part of what was done.
News you can use.
Yeah, exactly. So logic.
I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. I wanted to ask you guys all some questions together, but I wanted to ask one question more just to you, Betsy, which was, your latest research examines why people leave organizations. And I guess this is sort of a broad question, but in your conclusion, what's more important, facts or feelings, when people make a decision like that?
Yes.
All right, back to the round table. So trust anything between your stomach and your head?
When we analyzed the data, we found both facts and feelings.
Okay.
Anything ranging from feeling financially secure to not feeling wanted in the organization anymore.
Okay.
So.
Can I jump in? I mean, I don't know where you want, just because there's some interesting contrasts in the way that, because we collect a lot of data too, but I see differences in how we're thinking about it and how we're handling it that I think are really telling. First of all, what I'm taking is that a big part of the way that you look at problems is that you have to put yourself into the mindset of the person asking the questions and the person providing the answers. And it's funny, I like to sit up on a pedestal and say, well, science is objective, but we know very well that there are intrinsic biases. We bring biases to the table just because of who we are, how we're raised, what we prioritize. We ask questions that we think are exciting or important. Well, that already has a bias intrinsic in it from our background. And we found that scientists tend to be narrower than they might like to think in the way that they look at the world and the types of alternatives they're willing to consider, or even the way that they're asking their questions. So I absolutely take the point that your perspective shapes how you perceive things, and they shape, as a scientist, what we ask and how we ask it. I feel like as a process, again, I fall back on the fact that it's ultimately self-correcting. Somebody will figure that out and say, wait, we've been looking at this problem all wrong. We need to look at it this way. And so there is a way that even as imperfectly as it moves, that science still advances us towards that sort of answer.
Just to add to that, from the legal point of view, everybody thinks of the trial as closing or opening, when most of the work, many lawyers say that the winning or losing is done in voir dire. In state court, at least, where judges still allow the lawyers to do it. Federal court don't allow that much. But in voir dire, you're looking, and sometimes state court allow you to talk to the jurors for a couple hours. And you look them in the eyeball and see what kind of experiences they've had, and you try to do it subtly. And if that's half of the art of getting the perspective that will see the truth in the narrative.
Ted, what do you think about if you could interview the reviewers of the papers that you're submitting for a couple hours to pick your jury? Would that be a good addition or a bad addition?
It would certainly help my acceptance rate, but it would not be a good addition for the process of peer review. That would be a step backwards.
There'd be an opposing someone who would also be, doing.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you think about? I mean, I guess make the case or don't for peer review versus a jury system, for example. Is that, versus not for a jury, but for an adversarial system? Should there be? The sort of thing, like, I remember like the intelligence community, right? They said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and they said, well, we had this bias because that's what they wanted us to find, so we found it. Or, we suggested that that's what so then they said, okay, we'll invite another group whose job is just to argue with the people that tell us what we want to hear, that tell us what we don't want to hear. And this is the sort of, broadly a team of rivals theory or just rivals theory, or it's just an example of, then you need a third group to argue with, so, what's the right number? Should you have peer reviewers, or should you have people that are like, should you have an adversarial, or Betsy, I kind of wonder of your take here. Do you like the system the way it is?
I mean, I'm going to argue there are parts of the system that don't work as well as they could or should, and there are problems with peer review. There are manuscripts, peer reviewers are busy, they're exhausted, they've only got so much time. They don't always catch things that we wish that they would, and papers get through that you look at afterwards and it's like, oh my God, how did that get through? Yeah. But again, science is self-correcting because they get through and people say, you can't say this, and they go through the analyses and they figure out that it was done wrong, and then the paper gets retracted or the field moves forward. So peer review isn't perfect. It's also not perfect because it's blind, and so you have people that can knock down their opponents or knock down people that have views that they don't agree with, and that happens. But again, in the end, I'm the believer. I think that so sometimes it doesn't work well, and some jerk knocks your paper down because they don't like your ideas or because it's contesting theirs. But another journal, you get a different set of reviewers, and somebody will look at it objectively, and eventually the paper will get out. And if it is actually accurate, or if it is close to the truth, then it will ultimately lead to one step forward in the field. But I want to come back to the data thing, because we handle data differently.
So differently,
I think, too.
yeah.
I mean, I would say we look at data, but data can get really messy in all kinds of ways. We try to find patterns. We want to know what's the mean, what's the how clear is the signal that we're getting for this relationship, and if we're trying to compare things, we have really robust sort of statistical tools to say, is this sample different from that one, yes or no, and it doesn't sound to me like you guys, the qualitative approach handles data the same way at all.
I definitely look for patterns.
Are there controls built into your question sequences so that you have a way to remove confounding variables like age or economic status or where you are in the hierarchy of the business?
That becomes less important. Okay.
Okay. Why?
Well,
I don't mean that rudely. I just mean like it's so different from how
let me
I'm
take
used
a
to
shot
looking
at
the world.
because-
It's like, why is it the
Doug,
story?
because
Wait,
there's
so-
objective moral truth in the world. Where's the scientific evidence for the fact that napalming babies is immoral? Where is it? It's not there. But it's an objective truth.
Okay, so a different kind of truth is what you're
Well,
getting at.
yeah, that's the issue, right?
Yeah.
It's
There's
a
maybe
moral
categories. I mean, there are things that the scientific process doesn't
truth. We would not. I
Also,
mean, I
like,
would
if you
argue
don't-
that
if
we
you don't know
don't
who
tackle
did it,
those kinds
yeah.
of questions. We're interested in explaining
Yeah.
phenomena. For me, in the natural world.
Do you
But,
feel-
it's different? But we want to explain it, so we want to know what the patterns are. We want to,
Do you feel like in court you're doing the same arguments over and over again, or is there some kind of consensus? Yeah, I guess for all of you, I'll just ask: is consensus a good thing? Is consensus a bad thing? Is that the same as just the popular will, or whoever? If you can fool most of the people most of the time?
Look, no one trial is alike, no one story is alike. All people have things in common but different. And the testimony of that, again, usually in state court, is we're still allowed to interview jurors afterwards. And what you're struck with is the sincerity with which they followed the jury instructions, the sincerity with which they weighed the evidence, the sincerity with which they rejected their own prejudices and tried to do as the judge had instructed. In these difficult cases. So, I think every case is different. Obviously, as a trial lawyer, we have various ways of approaching the case that are over and over again, but it's never the same. My stomach has been eating Rolaids constantly for 30 years.
Do you? I just ask each of you in turn. I'm going to ask a quick, just yes, no. Do you believe in objective truth?
An objective truth?
Yeah.
No.
Not.
yes,
Of course, yes.
definitely yes.
No. Yes. Do you lie in real life?
Can't we take the fifth?
Just to be clear, if you say yes, I won't. It will.
Does
it will
Santa
be a
Claus
question.
count?
I
Lies,
won't
of
know
course.
if that's true. That's
Everybody
fair.
everybody
Yes.
engages in white lies.
Yeah, sure.
My job at the FBI was inherently to lie. Part of it was, undercover operations during crimes and of the mafia. It was at the height of the pizza connection. And by definition, we were engaging in a scheme that would allow us to lie in an effective way that would reach crime in a way that, you don't find a bank robber. And we would approve those undercover operations or those wiretaps, only if the circumstances warranted. But by definition, it was a lie in order to get to the truth, which was a guilty verdict of the mafia.
Interesting.
I remember when I was in the MFA program in creative writing, that's what we called fiction. It's the lie that tells the truth. So, but that's all good. So I think we're hitting the time. We just have time for a couple questions, or
Absolutely, we can take questions from the
that's what we'd love to do.
You're not turned on, so.
There we go.
There you go.
We can take questions from the floor, and I just point out before we get started that we have maybe 10 more minutes to go, but there's a reception afterwards, so don't rush off. Right outside here, there's refreshments, so stay and discuss.
Hi, Armand Duell. I'm in the philosophy department. I think there was a great amount of agreement here, and I was heartened by that. I actually think that all of you think that truth is largely independent of opinion about what the truth is. And that truth, in your case, Betsy, might be subjectively dependent because you're studying other people, and that's okay. Doug, what you're studying is mind independent. It's about what's out in the world. But all of you think that truth is independent of opinion. I think that's really important, and I think that's something that doesn't get firmly fixed in today's discussions about truth firmly enough, and I think it can't be emphasized enough. There are a couple things that I wanted to emphasize. Philosophers like to make distinctions, and we like to make them because we think they're useful. Truth is one thing. It seems to be largely independent of opinion. But then there's questions about justification for claims about the world or about other people and what they're thinking. And justification comes in degrees. We can be more or less certain about our claims. Betsy, your job seems to be about the hardest one there is amongst you up there. It is just very hard to get definitive justification for certain kinds of claims.
Absolutely.
It comes in degrees. You're researching something which is just very hard to get at because you want to know what's in other people's minds. That's very tough. That said, you're looking for justification, and you recognize that it comes in degrees. And same thing goes for everybody else as well. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention about that is that often there's a conflation between coherence as a description of what truth consists in and coherence as justification. I want to emphasize that philosophers, by and large, at least today, think that coherence is a property of justification. It's not constitutive of truth. That's why you can have two different perfectly coherent stories, but at most one of those things is true. And then the final thing I wanted to mention is persuasiveness, right? What's persuasive to someone might have very little to do with how well a particular claim justifies truth claims. And I think keeping all of those things very clear can only help us in thinking about the truth generally. I really appreciated all your contributions. Thank you very much for them. So I would just invite you to comment on these kinds of distinctions if there's anything useful that comes from it.
Go ahead.
I'll just say very quickly, on the persuasiveness point, I understand, in my area at least, there's nothing, facts are persuasive. I mean, I've had dog cases where I've done my best to persuade, but if I've got good facts, like I had a case in Idaho 3 years ago, bad faith against the jury and against an insurance company who had failed against the hospital's will to try to settle with a woman, 42-year-old, had an embolism, died, she had 5 kids, 6 times to the office in 2 weeks. I didn't win that. We got a $9 million punitive damage verdict. That wasn't my persuasion. That was all I had to do was tell those facts. I did have to tell it in a narrative form, like from her point of view, but it was the facts. The persuasion was the facts. So that's the best case.
I want to give a counterexample, which I think really, this is one that we talked about the other day, that really, to me, showcases the difference in the way that we perceive this stuff. And this, I didn't realize that the O.J. Simpson trial is now being made into a television show. But this is an example from the O.J. Simpson trial. I was a graduate student at the time, and I knew the biologist that was being brought in to testify on the DNA fingerprinting, the parentage data. And here's a case where the way the scientist looks at the world and the way the jury or the courtroom looked at the world could not have been more starkly different. And it had really drastic consequences. And so just to tell it really quickly, because I know we're under time crunch, they'd found a blood sample. They were able to show that there were markers in the blood sample that matched O.J. Simpson's. And the biologist, the statistician, was brought in there to say, how likely is it that if you just took a blood sample from a random person, that you would get the same markers matching? And normally our standard of proof in most things that we do is about 1 in 20. It's a 95% confidence in something. And the scientist came up there and said, you know, if you do this analysis, it's essentially 1 in 1,500 is the probability that that sample, that those markers would line up at random. The defense attorneys pushed back hard and said, what were your assumptions? What was the model that you used? Did you just use the sort of US population at large as your baseline? Or did you use a local population that includes the same ratio of African Americans and a population that was much closer to the local area where OJ had been? The scientists said, that's a great idea, and went and redid the analyses using that other data set, and it changed the probability a little bit. It went from 1 in 1,500 to 1 in 600. Now, again, to a scientist, that's stunningly significant. I mean, 1 in 600, the chances that you would have that it's ridiculous. It's absolutely overwhelmingly convincing to a scientist. The court essentially freaked out, said the scientist changed his opinion. He backpedaled on the court of law, and his original estimate was more damning than the new one, so clearly he was biased in his original analyses. And if I'm not mistaken, it was tossed out of the case. So the science was actually ruled inadmissible because the scientist had changed his opinion.
Well, I mean, look, first of all, OJ, and Judge Ito, everything was wrong with that trial.
But it illustrates the difference in view, the standard of proof, and the way that you judge. It's the category.
The Judicial Conference on Evidence meets there, all the judges, the fancy judges that edit these things. They just met on Friday in D.C., and the American College gets to have an observer. We don't get to say anything. But experts is always the topic of discussion, and how, because the balance is, again, when you're telling the perspective, and so I can afford an expert from this place and pay him a lot of money and get him in there, and maybe the other person can't. So the balancing of the prejudice of an expert is something that the court system is very sensitive about. And I will tell you that in post-jury interviews, at least in the softer sciences, not really in the hard sciences, but in the softer sciences, post-jury, most of the jury say, I figured both experts kind of got paid to say what they were going to say. And they kind
Again,
of
it comes back to, is it objective or subjective?
Well, you get back to the very basics of Aristotle and what we teach in our discipline. You look at logos, ethos, and pathos. Logic and the facts. Ethos is the credibility of the speaker and any psychological appeals that you will use. It was the credibility that they focused on.
That's right.
Over here, can you hear me?
Cool.
What's refreshing is that you guys care what's true, and I'm not sure that could be said for the public at large. So thank you for that. In science, hypothesis is true until it's falsified. I suppose that means you're right until you're wrong. You're trying to get at something true. Is it easier to turn it around the other way and ask, what is not true? What are lies? What is bullshit? Somebody just makes it up. Is it easier to identify than truth?
In my world, and it may be true totally, it's less relevant because the reason I'm in a courtroom is either there's a criminal dispute or a civil dispute, so the issue has been focused, so I never have to look at what's false just for the sake of it, but I would think overall it would be easier, although,
Would that come back to the credibility and the motive?
Yeah, it would come back to credibility. I mean, at this time of the semester, it's always when, grandmothers beware because everybody's killing off their grandmothers. You look at who's being the most deceptive, I guess. So,
in my discipline of journalism, it's interesting where you're telling a story, but you have to interview a bunch of witnesses, but you're kind of in theory, the teller of the story. There's not a counter story. And what I often do is I interview people, and I'm totally swayed by them. I'm just pretty open. And then I just go to the next person, and I go, oh, this is what's true, right? And then they either go, yeah, you've got it exactly. I don't know why you're even interviewing me. Or they go, oh, you're ridiculous, you're an idiot. And I kind of talk to, 6, 7, or 8 people in a row on a particular domain, and, I kind of let them argue with, I don't usually say, this is what this person said, or this is what that person said. I just sort of try to be swayed and go to the next person kind of guilelessly. It's interesting, just let them argue, and then I go back and I say, oh, is this, or I go to the third person, not unlike this format. And, for better or for worse, that's kind of the process, that I've found in that realm. So I don't know if that counts as bullshit. It's more just like, this is what I heard. Do you think it's bullshit? That's not on me to distinguish that entirely. But people, of course, hate that about journalism. But they don't like that you're letting the liars say what they think is true, too.
I mean, I guess the deeper issue for me there is that what you're really getting at is what standard of proof are people going to need? What amount of evidence are they going to need to accept something is correct? And at what point are they willing to say that is patently wrong? And I feel like this is an issue that as a society we're going to have to grapple with a lot right now, because it really is a situation where the narratives that are getting told by people with, the right podium, the right access to. They're not being based on what I would consider to be facts or an evidence or in any kind of a self-correcting objective process. And people don't seem to care.
Love to hear this.
Well, I think maybe my question is irrelevant because in today's, based upon what you just said, because in today we all live in this echo chamber, I think they call it, where we only listen to what
It's true.
Supports my initial thoughts anyway.
Yes.
So the real question is anybody really interested in the truth? All I'm interested in is my position being reinforced. And whether you're on the right or the left, from my perspective, it's horrible on both sides. And nobody really is interested in the concept of the truth. I'm just only interested in having my biases reinforced.
That's why I can breathe when I'm in the courtroom. I just feel I want to be able to say to everybody talking in D.C., that's irrelevant, or I moved a strike, or that doesn't pass Rule 403, and it's just I know I'm being narrow-minded here, but that is what's refreshing about the judicial system.
And
I agree with you.
Do you feel that way about yourself? I mean, you said it. You said it.
I mean, it is very difficult. We really try to watch all of the newscasts.
Yeah.
And it is absolutely, I think, essential that people will do this. But I had a friend, she said, because I'm from Washington, D.C., I was a lobbyist. I was one of those horrible people. And she says, well, how do you find it? I said, you've got to read everything you can, and you have to listen to every opposition. And she said, well, that's too much work. I was just aghast. As a very intelligent individual, it is too much work to try to figure out what's true.
And they don't even try anymore. We were just talking about this. Yeah, I grew up in eastern Montana. We only had one TV station, NBC, but it was Huntley Brinkley. And remember, they read and reported the news, and they cared that it was kind of neutral. That was kind of part of the thing.
I think you're absolutely right, that people tune into the sources of information that they want to see. And Facebook, the social media things do that whether people realize it or not. It's all filtered, and you only see the kinds of stories that are consistent with the people that you friended. And it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. And it's something, in science for a long time, I think for more than 2 decades, people realized that we haven't done a good job teaching kids in the elementary and the middle school classrooms what science is, how we learn, how we advance our understanding of the world around us, and what the process is. And by not teaching, and we're trying, a lot of smart people have tried to look into ways to teach it better. I don't know that we're having the effect that we would like, but they're trying. Because if you can't teach people to think and to assess information and to evaluate, I'm trying to remember the term that you just used, Armand, but the level of confidence that you essentially have in accepting a particular answer is correct, then we can't expect them to be making informed decisions on anything. And then you have this really astonishing thing that happens where, as Mark said, hypothesis works until it's rejected. There have been lots of incidents in the last 15 years where long-standing views that are deeply entrenched in the academic community, we suddenly figure out we were wrong, and new evidence comes, and again, the whole process self-corrects. Those are triumphal moments. That is science at its absolute best. I mean, that's the best testament there could be for this as a way of learning about the world. And yet, it's amazing to look at what happens in society. People lose faith in science. They think, oh, the scientists were wrong. It's like, why should I bother with science? The scientists were wrong. They'll go and look for some other source of answers. And at the very moment when they should become converts, for lack of a better way, because the process triumphs, they lose their faith and they look for answers somewhere else. And to me, that reflects the fact that we haven't taught them about how the process works and how to evaluate truth, things that are more likely to be true from things that are less likely to be true. I don't know.
Well,
I guess it's something I'm really...
Talk to these guys one-on-one.
we out of time already?
Interrogate them.
becomes so important.
And
I didn't mean to use all
yeah, is this our timing?
This is our timing.
Yeah.
What is
Sorry
true
if
is
you were
we
gonna
have
jump in.
one last question.
Oh, please.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, maybe it's just an affirmation of a lot of what you've said. I'm a recently retired professor of social work, and I thought you'd like to know that we use what you research and apply it. So in a very applied helping profession sort of way, I thought it would be helpful for you to know how we use some of this when we help individual, we call them clients or maybe patients. An example would be, everybody knows that Gigi Wykes here is, I'm making this up now, is an alcoholic. She meets all the criteria from the DSM Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's all been figured out, and clearly, the data shows that she is, but she doesn't see it and she doesn't believe it. So truth to her is that she is not, and that is where you start. You can try all you want to convince her that she is, and contrary to the intervention show on TV, that stuff doesn't work. The more you harangue people with what is your truth, the less likely they are to believe it, the more defensive they become. And so we use, I would say, qualitative measures as well to help people get to the quantitative data that they really do have a problem, but it's up to them to do it. And I also was going to say, in defense of Betsy in some ways, there's some classic studies that showed that when you were trying to, when you were interviewing people who were admitted to mental health facilities, inpatient, if you only asked certain questions, you would only get certain answers, right? And so if you let people tell their story, what they found was that person after person after person was saying, I have trauma in my life. Many of them were sexual assault survivors, that sort of thing. And that was not one of the questions. Mm-hmm. And so you missed that whole realm of why people were there and why they were drinking to mask their feelings. And so it's powerful stuff in the application in real people's lives. So thank you.
Can I just say one? If any of you are interested in reading a little more about this, I came across an article, an opinion piece in the New York Times on April 17th, and it's talking exactly about what we're talking about. If anybody's interested, I can give you the URL over cocktails.
Well, I want to thank our panelists and our moderator and invite you all to reception outside. It is true that there are refreshments outside. Please join us.